Hey everyone, Dogen here. In today's video, which is a sponsored video sponsored by NordVPN, more information in the link below, I'll be talking about how I'm currently studying Japanese. One of the main themes of this video is going to be immersion, and that's because I believe that immersion, exposing yourself to as much native speech as possible, as opposed to exposing yourself to speech of other foreigners trying to learn Japanese, I think that immersion-based approach is by far the most effective for essentially all learners. There's going to be 4 different elements of the learning process, well, 4 different fields, I guess: reading, writing, listening, and speaking that I like to cover. So let's just jump right in and talk about reading. In the past, the approach that I took was to use Anki apps, so vocab decks, Anki vocab decks, to learn as many new words as possible, and to combine that with reading books in Japanese, literature, so novels. And I find that this approach worked very well. Main authors that I've read over the years, I would say, are probably Kanehara Hitomi, Murakami Ryu, Mishima Yukio, and I've read a lot of Murakami Haruki as well, although I'm not a very big fan of Murakami Haruki. Everyone just tells you that you got to read him when you start learning Japanese, but I much prefer Murakami Ryu. Audition, that Japanese movie, it's actually based off of the novel Audition that he wrote. I like that basically everything that I've read from him. Once you get to a certain level, you have to kind of actively start searching out for content that challenges you. So novels that are set in kind of like normal society, they're not terribly challenging for me anymore at this point. So in order to find new ways to challenge myself and expose myself to new words and kind of new grammar structures, new writing styles and stuff like that, I actually kind of have to deviate a little bit from novels and go into more specific fields. For example, I recently read this book, Kurashi o Tateru. This is a book about architecture because, well, one of the reasons is I'm actually building a house in Japan right now. Beyond that, I also find that actually these kind of JLPT prep books, these are all prep books specifically for the reading section of N1. These can be really good for maintaining a high level of Japanese. And the reason for that is because they cover a whole variety of topics. They're all definitely at that N1 level. And they're also written in so many different styles. Some of the essays that are written in this book are opinion pieces. Some of them are much more objective kind of accounts of an event. Some of them are 2 opinions going back and forth, and you have to kind of try and understand what one author is saying, what the other author is saying, find out where they overlap, and etc. Another great thing about these books is once you get to that level, you can learn about different subjects, such as maybe economics and the various views on economics in Japanese, but just by going through these books. My friend Norm had a great quote, I want to say in a video that we did about 2 years ago, Norm from Tokyo Lens. He said, try and do something every day. So I try and do maybe 1 exercise, 1 page worth of drills in these books each day, typically during my lunch break. If you don't actively do that and go beyond kind of the day-to-day Japanese, certainly your Japanese vocab, your reading abilities, it will start to deteriorate. That's at least what I've found. So these books can be great for keeping a certain level. And of course, if you ever want to actually take N1 and you've been going through books like this and doing 1 exercise or 2 exercises a day, you'll be in a great position. So I think that's probably good for the reading section. When it comes to writing, as many of you probably imagine, I practice writing in my work because my work is to create scripts in Japanese, comedic scripts in Japanese. If not every day, probably at least every other day, I'm writing something in Japanese. And I script out all those videos. And usually what happens is maybe every other video or so, there's a line or maybe 1 line that I think, okay, I know that this is good enough as is. The joke, the idea will still the Japanese audience will still understand this and probably giggle at it. However, is this the absolute best way to express this idea? Would it be better if I expressed it like this? And I'll prepare that same line maybe 2 or 3 different ways, because there are, even in English, my native language, there's always dozens and dozens and dozens of different ways to express a single idea. What I'll do is I'll write out both options and then I'll consult with a native speaker and I'll say, does this feel more natural to you? Does this feel more natural to you? Do these 2 different ways of writing this, do they even feel different for you? Or do they feel the exact same? Then based on that feedback, I'll decide which line to go with. And this is really great for me because it means that every now and then when I'm watching my old content, I'll run into one of these points that I struggled with, and it allows me to review those points and also see kind of the answers to those points. I'm able to see the things that I've struggled with, see the answers, and grow from that experience. I quite like the George Orwell approach of trying to express ideas in the simplest way possible. I find that for what I'm doing, trying to tell jokes in Japanese, this is the best thing to do. In the past, I tried to purposely use a lot of like N1 grammar to try and make myself sound smart, but this always backfired. And I found that, especially again, when it comes to comedy, the best thing to do is to just use the simplest language possible to communicate the idea. Okay, so point 3, listening. I think I mentioned this at the beginning of this video, but I strongly believe that regardless of the level that you're at, the single best thing that you can do for improving your Japanese is listening to as much native speech as possible. And I explicitly say native speech because if you're learning Japanese in a classroom setting and also have a full curriculum of other subjects that you're also studying, then a fair amount of the Japanese that you hear might be other foreigners trying to speak Japanese rather than native speech. And obviously, if half of the Japanese that you're hearing is not native Japanese, that's not good for trying to develop a native-like accent. And also, what would you say? Use grammar and express yourself and articulate your thoughts in a way that a Japanese native speaker would, as opposed to someone that's trying to translate their thoughts kind of from English into Japanese, which that's another subject that I think my friend Matt versus Japan can probably break down with better than I can. But again, regardless of your level, the single best thing that you can do for improving your Japanese is to listen to as much native Japanese as possible. And this is true for me too. You can't just listen to Dogen videos and expect your Japanese to get to a native level because my Japanese is not at a native level. So listen to as much native content as possible. Again, regardless of your level. And when it comes to my particular situation, as it was with reading, everyday life in Japan is not enough. The level of Japanese that you hear in everyday life in Japan, that's probably an N2 level as opposed to an N1 level. And this is also true for a fair number of, I would say most YouTube content, most Japanese YouTube content. And when you get to, again, a very high level and you want to maintain that level, this means actively going out and searching for things that are a little bit more specific. They're a little bit more niche. I talked about in the past how watching Attack on Titan is actually really good for me because it allows me to learn a lot of words that are related to war, such as zango, which means trench, or yosai, which means kind of defense base or like holdout or something like that, or maybe kantai, which I believe means fleet. I think that's the right word. Okay, that was the right word. Safe. But again, the point that I'm trying to make here is that when you get to a very high level, you have to actively go out and find new content that is a little bit more niche and kind of explores a certain specific trajectory such that you can pick up those new words that you wouldn't be exposed to unless you actively searched them out. But because I've seen Attack on Titan, the most recent season at this point, probably literally close to 20 times, the entire season, I've probably watched that 20 times. At this point, I've recently switched away from that and I'm currently rewatching Monster, which is my favorite anime ever by far, as it was recently released on one of the major streaming platforms in Japan. And this is where I'd like to make a shout out to today's sponsor, and that's because, well, Monster happens to be available where I am in Japan on one of these major streaming platforms that I'm already paying for. There's a lot of TV shows that I can't watch on that same platform because they're region locked. A lot of TV shows and anime and arguably masterpiece movies that any otaku like myself would know, I can't watch because I am in Japan. And this is where the sponsor of today's video, NordVPN, comes in. Regardless of whether you're talking about TV shows or even YouTube or subtitle options on these streaming platforms, what shows up is often entirely dependent on the region that you live in. For those that don't know, a VPN is essentially a piece of software that you can use to secure your internet connection and make sure that people aren't spying on you, but also kind of trick your computer, your internet connection, your internet provider into thinking that you're in a different region. So I can use NordVPN, which is super easy to install, set up, and use to kind of unlock the potential of the streaming service that I'm paying for and view all of the content that streaming service supports outside of Japan as well. NordVPN is one of the leaders in the VPN field, and they have an app that's easy, secure, and available on every major platform. Their connections are fast and reliable, which is obviously really important when it comes to streaming content, with more than 5,100 servers in 60 countries. And with one account, you can connect up to 6 devices at the same time, and this is great for someone like me who is often watching one thing on my streaming service while my wife is watching something on her streaming service. Go to nordvpn.com/Dogen right now in the link below to get a 2-year, 1-month plan at a big discount. And I also want to say thank you to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. I genuinely appreciate it because I'm in a very difficult financial situation right now because I'm building a house here and the banks kind of screwed us over. That's 10 different videos for the future. That'll be fun once the house is finished. But it really helps, genuinely. And I hope that you guys are able to benefit from their service. Hopefully it's a win-win-win situation. And again, check out NordVPN using the link in the description below. Okay, great. Now let's cover the final aspect of this video. So the speaking element of Japanese. I think that within speaking, there's probably 2 sections. One would be articulating your thoughts in conversation, so communication. And the other would be whether or not the sounds that you're making, whether they sound natural or not. And when it comes to communication, I think that the key to natural output in conversation, that is, as opposed to in writing, is input. The key to natural output is constant native input. When you're listening to native speech all the time, whether it's, in a drama or in an anime or in real life, wherever it might be, if you're doing that all the time and you have a basic understanding of Japanese grammar and maybe the 500 or 1,000 most common words in Japanese conversation, everyday speech, you naturally learn to articulate your thoughts in a natural way. But within the realm of speaking, I'd like to concentrate more on on sounding natural, pronunciation and pitch accent. So how am I currently studying these 2 things? So as many of you guys probably know, I also teach Japanese pronunciation and pitch accent, kind of intonation, not really intonation, but many people think of it as intonation on Patreon. And the overwhelming majority of the content of the lessons that I post over there, it's things that I learned directly from the intensive pronunciation and pitch accent course that I took at Keio University during study abroad. But there's a lot of kind of field research that I do as well. I survey a fair amount of native speakers. I talk with a trained native speaker that went through the NHK Academy. And then naturally, I double check a lot of my information and try and do additional research as well using some of these books. So I thought now would be a good time to kind of briefly break down these various resources that I use that you guys have seen in my videos in the past. Okay, so I've got 18 books here specifically about Japanese pronunciation and pitch accent. One of these is it's one of the handouts from study abroad from that intensive Hatsuon course that I took at Keio University. It's funny for me to kind of look through this, but obviously you guys can't buy this, so I'll just kind of go on to the next resource. First we have Nihongo Accent Nyumon, an introduction to Japanese accent. This is a Japanese-based resource, but this is great if you are good at reading Japanese already and are looking to learn about pitch accent, but don't do well with tables and word lists. It does a very good job of explaining things with simple language in a way that's easy to understand. And that contrasts with both of these, which are accent dictionaries, the NHK Accent Dictionary and the Shinmeikai Accent Dictionary. These are much more thorough, but the language is much more difficult to understand. These are both in Japanese as well. There's a lot of tables, a lot of word lists, and I would say a lot more technical language in these books as well. Generally, I think NHK it's a little bit more accessible, whereas Shinmeikai it's slightly more challenging, but it's also a little bit more thorough. Now we have 美しい日本語の発音. This book is more for, it's less about pitch accent. There is a lot about pitch accent in this book as well, but it's more about, what would you say, like almost oration, how to speak in a way that's kind of appealing. Typically aimed more for people, not foreigners that are trying to learn Japanese pitch accent, but more for Japanese people that would like to improve their own Japanese. Quite old, but I learned a lot from this book as well. Okay, I'm gonna skip over actually some of these books because I think some of these are perhaps a little bit too advanced for most people watching this video, but there are maybe 2 or 3 additional books in this list that I do think people could really benefit from. One being this, 音声を教える. So teaching phonology. This is also a Japanese resource, but this is a fantastic resource that covers not only pitch accent, but mostly pronunciation, more pronunciation and like rhythm than pitch accent, although it also covers pitch accent. It kind of covers everything that you need to know in order to sound natural. And although it is in Japanese, this is the #1 resource that I recommend Japanese learners buy for their Japanese language partners. So have your Japanese language partner buy this or read this, buy it for them, and have them read through it. They can read through this entire book in like 1 hour. If they go through this, they'll immediately be able to articulate what's wrong with your spoken Japanese in terms of pronunciation, and to pitch accent to a certain degree. More pronunciation, but this is really good for making Japanese people aware of pronunciation issues that they can detect, how to correct those issues. The two other main resources that I wanted to briefly talk about are these: The Sounds of Japanese by Dr. Vance and The Phonology of Japanese by Lebrun. These are also incredibly detailed, awesome resources for everything Japanese pronunciation and pitch accent related. I think they're the two single best books for learning everything there is to learn about Japanese pronunciation and pitch accent in English. This is a little bit newer. It's got this book references this book a fair amount. But I think that for most people, the major difference is going to be accessibility. And what I mean by that is, I think that Dr. Vance does a better job of explaining things to people who don't have a background in linguistics and have never studied pitch accent, phonology or linguistics at all before. He kind of breaks things down at the beginning. This is a little bit easier to read for people that have no experience in that field, where I think that the Phonology of Japanese, again, it's newer, it's maybe a little bit more thorough, but also I think that it's a little bit more challenging. This book is probably better if you already know a fair amount about linguistics, whereas this book is it's more accessible if you've never studied that field before. And then one kind of final English-based resource. This is an introduction to Japanese linguistics. This is a great all-around book about Japanese linguistics beyond just pronunciation and pitch accent. So it covers pronunciation and pitch accent, of course, because those are aspects of Japanese linguistics, but there's other parts of Japanese linguistics as well, Japanese grammar, etc. So this book this is like your one-stop shop for all Japanese linguistics. This is a great book for that. Hopefully that's kind of a good introduction for some of the books that you guys have seen on my shelf before. And if any of you guys have been wondering about the content of these books, hopefully you know a little bit more about them now. And of course, these resources that I just recommended, I'll link them in my entire bibliography for Japanese pitch accent in the description below as well. But I think that's probably good for this video. Again, kind of the main takeaway point is I strongly believe the single best thing that you can do in order to improve your Japanese, regardless of your level, is to listen to as much native Japanese as possible. Thanks again to NordVPN for sponsoring this video. Hope that you guys check out their service. All right, talk to you guys again soon. Sayonara.